had been traveling a lot for work lately, and honestly, I was exhausted. Flying from city to city and living out of a suitcase wasn't exactly glamorous, but it paid the bills. After weeks of back-to-back meetings, I finally had a break. I decided I'd rent an Airbnb in a quiet town outside the city, a small place where I could sleep, unwind, and breathe for a few days. I didn't want a hotel. I wanted something private, something that felt a little more like home. The Airbnb listing seemed perfect. A small one-bedroom guest house on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and away from the noise. The photos showed a cozy place with simple furniture, clean white walls, and big windows that let in plenty of natural light. It looked peaceful. The host, Alex, had plenty of good reviews. People described him as friendly and responsive but not intrusive. Gives you space but is there if you need him, one review said. That was exactly what I wanted. No awkward small talk with a host, just a place where I could disappear for a few days and recharge. I booked it for 4 nights. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was starting to set as I pulled up the long gravel driveway. The main house sat back from the road, a 2-story place with dark wood siding and a big wraparound porch. The guest house was off to the side, tucked behind a row of tall hedges. It was smaller than I'd expected, just 1 floor with a sloped roof and a little front porch. There was a key in a lockbox by the door, just like Alex had said. I punched in the code he sent me, grabbed the key, and let myself in. The place was spotless, small but cozy, just like the photos. The living room had a couch and a small TV, and the kitchen was stocked with all the basics: pots, pans, utensils, and even some coffee and tea. There was a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed and a small bathroom with a shower. Simple, quiet, exactly what I needed. I unpacked my bag, put some groceries in the fridge, and sat on the couch for a while, just enjoying the silence. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls, just the sound of the wind in the trees outside. That first night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it lounging around the house, reading and scrolling on my phone. Around noon, I went for a walk down the gravel road, enjoying the fresh air and the smell of pine trees. There were a few other houses scattered along the road, but they were far apart, separated by patches of woods. I didn't see anyone else the entire time I was out. Back at the guest house, I made myself some dinner and watched a couple of episodes of some show on Netflix. The sun went down, and the woods outside the windows turned pitch black. I thought about closing the blinds, but I kind of liked being able to see outside. It made the place feel bigger somehow. Around 11 p.m., I went to bed. That's when things started to feel off. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, just a faint noise, like something tapping on glass. I lay there in the dark, listening. The tapping stopped, then started again, softer this time. It was coming from the living room. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a tree branch brushing against the window. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, and crept toward the living room. The tapping stopped as soon as I stepped into the room. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the window. Nothing, just my own reflection in the glass. I felt stupid. Of course it was nothing. I was in the middle of nowhere. It was probably just the wind. I went back to bed. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I'd been stressed and overtired, and my brain was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent most of the day inside, trying to focus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. Every time I looked outside, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching me, but there was never anyone there. That night, it happened again. I woke up to the same tapping sound, only this time it was louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the same window in the living room. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I made my way toward the living room. The tapping stopped just before I reached the window. I shined the light outside, but all I could see was my own reflection staring back at me. Then I noticed something. The lock on the front door. It was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before I went to bed. A chill ran down my spine. I locked the door again and double-checked all the windows. Everything else was secure. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock the door earlier. I was tired, distracted. It was an honest mistake. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next day, I called Alex. I didn't tell him everything, just that I thought someone might have tried to get into the guest house during the night. He seemed concerned and promised to come by later to check things out. He never showed up. I tried calling him again, but it went straight to voicemail. By the time the sun went down, I was on edge. Every little noise made me jump. The wind outside sounded like footsteps. The creak of the floorboards sounded like someone moving through the house. I locked the door and propped a chair under the doorknob, just to be safe. Then I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand, watching the front door. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Around midnight, I finally started to relax. I told myself I was being ridiculous, and then the power went out. The TV flickered off, plunging the room into darkness. For a second, I just sat there, frozen. My phone was the only source of light. I turned on the flashlight again and got up to check the breaker box. It was in a small closet in the hallway. I opened the door and shined the light inside. All the switches were in the on position. That's when I heard it. A soft click. The sound of the front door unlocking. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted out the back door and into the woods, my bare feet slipping on the wet grass. I didn't stop until I was deep in the trees, far enough that I couldn't see the guest house anymore. I crouched behind a tree, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek back toward the house. The front door was wide open. A man was standing in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring out into the darkness, like he was waiting for something, or someone. I stayed in the woods until dawn. When the sun came up, the man was gone. The front door was closed. I ran back to the house, grabbed my bag and my keys, and got the hell out of there. I never looked back. I reported everything to Airbnb and the local police, but they never found anything. Alex never responded to my messages. His profile disappeared from the site a few days later. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted. All I know is I'll never stay in an Airbnb again. It was late spring when I decided I needed a break. Work had been running me into the ground for months, and my apartment in the city had begun to feel like a prison. I wanted something quiet, somewhere far away from the noise and the stress. After a bit of browsing, I found an Airbnb that seemed perfect. A small, remote cabin in the middle of the woods, about 3 hours outside the city. The listing described it as a cozy, off-the-grid retreat with modern amenities, and the photos showed a neat little cabin surrounded by towering trees. It looked peaceful, exactly what I needed. I booked it for a week. The host, a man named Gary, messaged me shortly after to confirm everything and give me the details. He mentioned that the cabin didn't have cell service, but there was a landline for emergencies. He also said there was a caretaker who lived a few miles down the road in case I needed anything. That seemed fine to me. Honestly, being disconnected from everything sounded like a bonus. The drive out there was beautiful. The roads wound through thick forests and rolling hills, and the air smelled fresh and clean. As I got closer to the cabin, The paved road turned into gravel, then dirt. My car rattled and bumped along, but it held up. Finally, after about 15 minutes of navigating the dirt road, I saw the cabin tucked into a small clearing. It looked just like the photos. A simple wooden structure with a porch and a couple of rocking chairs out front. The trees around it were tall and dense, their leaves whispering in the breeze. It felt like I had stepped into another world, far away from everything. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The cabin was cozy, just as advertised. The main room had a couch, a small kitchen, and a stone fireplace. There was a single bedroom in the back and a bathroom with a surprisingly modern shower. The windows let in plenty of light, and everything was clean and well maintained. After unpacking, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch. The quiet was almost unsettling at first. I'm used to the constant hum of the city, cars, people, sirens. Here, there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. It took me a while to relax, but eventually, I leaned back in the rocking chair and closed my eyes, enjoying the stillness. The first couple of days were uneventful. I went for long walks in the woods, read books, and cooked simple meals. I found a stack of old board games in the cabinet and even spent an afternoon playing solitaire. It was exactly what I had hoped for, peaceful and quiet. On the third night, though, something strange happened. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustling, but it was enough to wake me up. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. I stayed still, listening. The rustling stopped, then started again, closer this time. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the leaves. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The cabin didn't have curtains, so the moonlight spilled through the windows, casting pale light across the room. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It didn't seem like an animal anymore. It was too deliberate, too heavy. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded away, and everything went quiet again. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I lay back down but didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The ground was soft from the rain 2 nights ago, and sure enough, there were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They circled around the cabin, weaving in and out of the trees. My stomach tightened. Maybe it was the caretaker, I thought, or someone hiking through the woods. But why would they walk around my cabin in the middle of the night? I tried to brush it off and went about my day, but the thought gnawed at me. By evening, I was on edge, jumping at every little noise. I locked the doors and windows and double-checked them before bed. The landline phone sat on the small table by the couch, and I made a mental note of it in case I needed to call someone. That night, I woke up again to the sound of footsteps. This time, they were right outside the window. My heart leapt into my throat. I lay completely still, listening. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, circling the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves and the soft thud of boots on the ground. Then they stopped, right outside the bedroom window. I held my breath, staring at the window. The moonlight lit up the glass, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faint reflection of the room. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a shadow moved across the window. It was quick, just a flicker of movement, but it was enough. I shot out of bed and grabbed the landline. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number for the caretaker. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. I hung up and tried again. Still nothing. I stood there, clutching the phone, unsure of what to do. The footsteps started again, moving away from the cabin this time. I waited, listening until they faded into the distance, then sat down on the couch, my heart racing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept the lights on and sat by the window watching the woods. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I called Gary, the host, and told him what had happened. He sounded surprised but not overly concerned. He said he'd check with the caretaker and call me back. An hour later, he called and said the caretaker hadn't been anywhere near the cabin. "It's probably just a hunter or someone passing through," he said. "Nothing to worry about." I wasn't convinced. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping the doors locked and the curtains drawn. I kept the landline close and even found an old kitchen knife, which I kept on the table next to me. That night, it happened again. The footsteps started around midnight, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed the knife and the phone and locked myself in the bathroom. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, and waited. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, stopping and starting, moving closer, then farther away. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up to silence and the pale light of dawn filtering through the bathroom window. I cautiously opened the door and stepped out. Everything looked normal, but the unease lingered. I decided I couldn't stay there another night. I packed my things and left within an hour. The dirt road felt longer on the way out, every bump and rattle setting me on edge. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. When I finally reached the paved road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I drove straight home without stopping, the tension in my chest easing only when I pulled into my driveway. I never did find out who was outside the cabin those nights. Gary followed up with me a few days later, apologizing again and offering me a refund, which I accepted. He said he'd looked into it but hadn't found anything unusual. I've thought about it a lot since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was just a hunter, like Gary said. Maybe it was someone passing through. But the way those footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, still haunts me. I haven't gone back to the woods since. The idea of being out there, alone and cut off from everything, doesn't sound peaceful anymore. It sounds like a nightmare. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. I needed a break from everything: work, the city, and the noise that seemed to never stop. The listing was modest but had everything I needed. A quiet cabin just off the main road in a small town I'd never heard of, somewhere in upstate New York. The pictures showed a cozy little house tucked in the trees, a wide front porch, and big windows that let in plenty of light. The host's profile was clean and professional. No red flags. The plan was simple: spend 4 days relaxing, read a book, and maybe go for a couple of hikes if I felt like it. I just wanted quiet.
No emails, no distractions.
The price was too good to pass up, and it seemed like no one had booked it for weeks. I liked that.
No neighbors.
Just peace and quiet. The drive up took longer than I expected. I left late in the afternoon, and by the time I hit the smaller back roads leading to the cabin, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. My phone's GPS struggled to keep a signal. I kept losing service, watching the little blue dot freeze, jump forward, then disappear altogether. When I finally found the turnoff, the road narrowed to a dirt path winding through thick trees. My headlights barely lit up more than a few feet ahead, and the branches formed a canopy overhead, cutting out what little light was left. The road was rough, full of ruts and potholes, and I had to slow to a crawl. After what felt like forever, the trees opened up, and the cabin appeared in front of me. It looked just like the photos, a small single-story house with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. There were no other houses in sight. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away. I parked in the gravel driveway and sat in the car for a minute, just listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. The air was heavy and still, the kind of silence that feels too quiet, like something's waiting just out of sight. I shook it off, grabbed my bag, and headed for the front door. The lockbox was exactly where the host said it would be. I punched in the code, grabbed the key, and let myself in. The inside was clean but bare, almost too clean. It smelled faintly of bleach, like someone had scrubbed every surface before I got there. There was a small living room with a worn couch, a kitchenette, and a single bedroom down the hall. The furniture looked old but sturdy, functional. I dropped my bag on the couch and started unpacking. Nothing fancy, just a few changes of clothes, toiletries, and a couple of books. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, staring out into the dark woods. I couldn't see anything past the porch light, just an endless wall of black. It felt off. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity. I wasn't used to being so isolated. Back in the city, there was always noise, cars, sirens, people. Out here, it was just me and the trees. I locked the door, checked the windows, and went to bed. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, but in the dead silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. It sounded like footsteps on gravel. I froze, listening. Crunch, crunch. They were slow, deliberate, not the kind of sound an animal makes. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and grabbed my phone. No signal, of course. I cursed under my breath and crept to the window, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I peeked out, but the porch light didn't reach far enough to see anything beyond the driveway. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, straining to hear something, anything, but the night had gone quiet again. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a deer or a raccoon. It's the woods. There are animals everywhere. I went back to bed, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the gravel. They were faint, but they were there, clear enough to tell they weren't from an animal. They were human, barefoot, my stomach twisted. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a prank. Some local kids messing with the out-of-towner. That had to be it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent most of the day inside, keeping the curtains drawn. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the house settling, the wind in the trees. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I stuck to the main road, walking for about a mile before turning back. When I got back to the cabin, the front door was open. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart in my throat. I was sure I'd locked it. I remembered locking it. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the open door, waiting for something to move inside. Nothing did. I thought about leaving right then and there, just getting in my car and driving until I found somewhere with a signal. But my keys were inside, along with my wallet and everything else. I crept up the steps, trying to be as quiet as possible. The door swung open wider as I pushed it, the hinges creaking. The living room was empty, so was the kitchen. I grabbed my keys off the counter and backed out of the house, keeping my eyes on the hallway leading to the bedroom. I didn't pack. I didn't even put on my shoes. I just got in the car and started driving. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station about 20 miles away. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my phone as I tried to call the host. No answer. I called the police next. They said they'd send someone out to check the property. They asked if I wanted to file a report, but I said no. I just wanted to forget the whole thing. I never heard back from the police, and I never found out who or what was at the cabin that night. The host refunded my money without asking any questions. They didn't even leave a review. I still think about it sometimes. The footsteps, the open door, the feeling of being watched. I tell myself it was just some harmless prank, but deep down, I know it wasn't. Something wasn't right about that place, and I'll never go back. It was late October when I booked the Airbnb, just a short getaway to clear my head. I had been feeling burnt out at work and thought a change of scenery might help. I didn't need anything fancy, just a quiet place where I could be alone for a few days. The listing I found seemed perfect. A small cabin tucked in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the city. It was cheap, had decent reviews, and most importantly, it looked secluded. That was exactly what I needed. The photos made the cabin look cozy. Wood-paneled walls, a small but functional kitchen, a fireplace, and a deck overlooking the trees. I imagined myself sitting by the fire with a book, maybe taking long walks in the crisp autumn air. The description promised total privacy and a peaceful retreat. That sounded nice. I booked it for 3 nights, packed a bag with some clothes, snacks, and my laptop in case I wanted to watch a movie, then hit the road early Friday afternoon. The drive out there was uneventful at first. The highway was smooth and mostly empty. I had my playlist going, windows down a crack to let the cool air in. After an hour or so, I exited the highway and found myself on smaller, winding roads surrounded by trees. The further I drove, the narrower the roads got. I lost cell service about 20 minutes before reaching the cabin, which I expected. It was in the middle of nowhere, after all. But something about losing that connection made me feel just a little uneasy. I brushed it off. I'd spent enough time in rural areas to know that cell coverage wasn't always reliable. The final stretch of the drive was a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. The trees closed in on both sides, their bare branches arching over the road like a tunnel. Every now and then, I'd hit a deep pothole, the car bouncing hard enough to make me grip the wheel tighter. I hadn't seen another car for miles. Finally, the cabin came into view at the end of the road. It looked just like the photos, a small single-story structure with a wooden deck and a steeply pitched roof. There were no neighboring houses in sight, just trees and more trees. The air was cold and smelled like pine and damp leaves. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and made my way to the front door. The key was under a loose rock by the steps, just like the host said. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The cabin was dim, with just a bit of late afternoon light filtering through the windows. I flicked the light switch by the door. Nothing. I tried another switch. Still nothing. Okay, I muttered to myself. Maybe the power was out. That wasn't a big deal. There was a wood stove for heat, and I had brought a flashlight and extra batteries just in case. I found the flashlight in my bag and switched it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The cabin was small but cozy. The main room had a couch, a coffee table, and the wood stove in one corner. There was a tiny kitchen off to the side, and a short hallway led to a bathroom and a single bedroom. Everything looked clean, if a little old. I set my bag down and went to check the breaker box, which the host had mentioned was in a closet near the bathroom. Sure enough, one of the switches had tripped. I flipped it back, and the lights hummed to life. Relieved, I went back to the main room and started a fire in the stove. Took a little while to get it going, but soon the cabin was warm and filled with the smell of burning wood. I made myself a sandwich, opened a book, and settled in on the couch. The first few hours were peaceful. The wind rustled the trees outside, and the fire crackled softly. After a while, I started to feel sleepy. I checked my phone out of habit. No service, of course. But the time said it was just after 9 p.m. Early, but I figured I might as well get some rest. I turned off the lights, banked the fire so it wouldn't burn out completely, and headed to the bedroom. The bed was small but comfortable enough. I pulled the covers up to my chin, listening to the wind outside as I drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The cabin was completely dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire through the crack in the bedroom door. Something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. I lay there for a moment, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, a sound from outside. It was a soft thud, like footsteps on the deck. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a deer. But then it happened again. Thud, closer this time. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound moved across the deck, slow and deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window, careful to stay out of sight. I lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The deck was empty. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their shadows dancing across the ground. I stood there for a long time, waiting. My breath fogged up the window. Finally, I convinced myself that it really had been an animal. Maybe a branch had fallen, or the wind had knocked something over. I went back to bed, though it took a long time for me to fall asleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and the woods looked almost inviting. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to take a walk. There was a trail behind the cabin that the host had mentioned in their welcome message. The trail was narrow and winding, covered in fallen leaves. It led up a small hill, where the trees thinned out and gave me a clear view of the surrounding forest. It was beautiful, quiet, and peaceful. I stood there for a while, just taking it all in. That's when I noticed something on the ground a few feet away. Footprints. They were faint, but definitely human. The pattern didn't match the shoes I was wearing. I stared at them for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were old, left by a previous guest. But they looked fresh, the edges still sharp in the dirt. A chill ran down my spine. I turned and headed back to the cabin, walking quickly but trying not to panic. When I reached the cabin, I stopped in my tracks. The front door was open, not wide open, but just enough to make it clear that it hadn't been left that way by accident. I was sure I had locked it. My heart was pounding as I stepped inside. Everything looked the same. The fire had gone out, but my bag was still where I had left it, and nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked every room, opening every closet and cabinet, but there was no one there. I locked the door again, double-checking it this time. Then I sat on the couch trying to calm down. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the cabin made me jump. I kept the flashlight in my hand, ready to switch it on at the slightest sound. Sometime around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the soft thud of footsteps on the deck. This time, they didn't stop. They moved slowly around the cabin, pausing occasionally, then continuing. I sat frozen in bed, barely breathing. Then the footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom window. I didn't dare move. The seconds dragged on like hours. Finally, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. The first light, I packed my things as quickly as I could. I didn't care about breakfast or coffee. I just wanted to leave. As I loaded my bag into the car, I glanced back at the cabin. The front door was open again. I didn't go back to close it. I drove down the dirt road, the tires kicking up dust, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't breathe easy until I was back on the highway, with other cars around me and the city on the horizon. I never reported what happened to the host. I didn't even leave a review. I just wanted to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footsteps, about how they had stopped right outside my window, and I wonder who or what they were waiting for. It was around 6:30 p.m. when I arrived at the Airbnb, a small house tucked away in the countryside, surrounded by tall trees and endless fields. It wasn't exactly remote, but far enough that there were no neighbors in sight, and the nearest grocery store was about a 20-minute drive. I had rented it for 2 nights, just a quick getaway to clear my head. I'd been stressed from work lately and thought some time alone would do me good. The photos online made the place look cozy and peaceful. A one-bedroom cabin-style home with a modern interior, a nice little porch, and a big yard. The perfect spot to disconnect for a while. It was a chilly November evening, and the sun was just starting to set as I pulled up the gravel driveway. The house looked exactly like it did in the pictures. Maybe a little darker, a little more weathered, but nothing unusual. The air was crisp, and the wind made the dry leaves skitter across the ground. I stepped out of the car, stretched, and grabbed my overnight bag from the back seat. The key was under the mat, just like the host had promised in their message. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of wood and something else, a scent I couldn't quite place at first. Not unpleasant, just different. The floors creaked softly under my feet as I walked through the small living room, taking in the space. The furniture was simple but comfortable looking. A dark gray couch, a coffee table with a few magazines on it, a flat-screen TV mounted on the wall. The kitchen was just off the living room, separated by a small counter. It had all the basics: stove, fridge, microwave. There was even a basket of snacks on the counter, which I thought was a nice touch. I made a mental note to text the host later and thank them for it. The bedroom was at the back of the house, past a narrow hallway. It was cozy, with a queen-sized bed covered in a thick, cream-colored comforter and 2 matching nightstands. A single window looked out into the backyard, where the trees stood like silent sentinels in the fading light. I unpacked my bag, setting my toothbrush and toiletries in the bathroom, then headed back to the kitchen to make some coffee. I planned to spend the evening reading, maybe watching a movie, and just relaxing. No work emails, no social media, just peace and quiet. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I noticed the sound of the wind picking up outside. The trees swayed, their branches tapping lightly against the windows. It felt cozy inside, the kind of cozy that makes you appreciate being indoors on a cold night. But then, as I stood there sipping my coffee, I noticed something odd. A light flickered on and off outside, near the edge of the yard. Not a porch light, something farther out in the trees. At first, I thought it might be a reflection or maybe a car passing by on a distant road. But it happened again. A quick flash, then darkness. I frowned, setting my coffee down and walking over to the window for a closer look. The yard was still, the trees barely moving now. I waited, watching, but the light didn't flash again. Probably nothing, I thought. Maybe just the wind triggering a sensor light or something. I shook it off and went back to the couch, flipping on the TV. I scrolled through a few streaming apps before settling on an old thriller movie. Something about a detective hunting a serial killer. It seemed fitting for a night like this. About halfway through the movie, I heard it. A distinct noise from outside. A thud, followed by a scraping sound. I paused the movie, sitting up straighter. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the back of the house. I stood up and walked to the window in the kitchen, peering out into the darkness. The yard was empty as far as I could tell. The trees loomed in the distance, their bare branches clawing at the sky. I couldn't see anything unusual, but then the noise came again. A loud metallic scraping, followed by what sounded like footsteps on gravel. My pulse quickened. It sounded like it was right outside the back door. I grabbed my phone from the counter and turned on the flashlight, shining it through the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the yard. Nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog. Nothing to be scared of. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I locked the back door and checked the front door for good measure, making sure both were secure. Then I went back to the couch, my eyes flicking to the windows every few seconds. The movie felt less entertaining now. My mind kept wandering back to the noises, to the light I had seen earlier. I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination running wild. But then, just as I was starting to relax again, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock, more of a soft, deliberate tapping. 3 quick taps, then silence. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, my eyes locked on the front door. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I stood up slowly, my phone still in my hand. I debated calling the host, but what would I even say? Someone's knocking on the door. So what? It's not exactly an emergency. I walked to the door, hesitating for a moment before peeking through the peephole. No one was there. I frowned, unlocking the door and opening it just a crack. The porch was empty. The yard was quiet. I stepped outside, shining my phone's flashlight around. The beam swept across the porch, the gravel driveway, the trees. Nothing. But then, just as I was about to turn back inside, I noticed something strange on the ground near the edge of the porch. Footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the dim light, but they were there, fresh prints in the gravel. They led from the driveway to the porch, then back toward the side of the house. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't heard a car pull up, hadn't seen anyone walking around. So where had they come from? I followed the prints with my flashlight, my breath coming faster now. They disappeared around the corner of the house. For a moment, I stood there, debating whether to follow them or just go back inside and lock the door. Common sense told me to go back inside, to forget about the footprints and just wait it out until morning. But curiosity got the better of me. I walked around the side of the house, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The ground was uneven here, covered in dead leaves and patches of mud. The footprints were harder to see, but they were still there, leading toward the backyard. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the trees. And then I saw it. A small shed at the edge of the yard, half hidden by the trees. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I stopped, my flashlight trained on the shed. The footprints led straight to it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Should I go back to the house? Call the host? Call the police? Before I could decide, the door creaked open a little wider, revealing darkness inside. I swallowed hard, taking a step closer. My flashlight illuminated the interior, revealing tools hanging on the walls, a lawnmower in the corner, and nothing else. No one was there. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders relaxing. I had worked myself up over nothing, but just as I was about to turn back to the house, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from behind me. Footsteps. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was no one there. The footsteps stopped. And then, from somewhere deep in the trees, I heard a voice. Low, almost a whisper. Go back inside. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I turned and ran back to the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed the host. No answer. I tried calling again, but it went straight to voicemail. I paced the living room, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? I decided to call the police, but just as I was about to hit dial, I noticed something on the kitchen counter. A note that hadn't been there before. You should have listened. I booked the Airbnb because it seemed perfect. A quiet house in a small, out-of-the-way town, surrounded by woods. It had 5-star reviews, and the host was responsive and friendly. I needed a break from the city, and this seemed like the perfect escape. A weekend to reset, with no traffic noise, no emails, and no one knocking on my door. The pictures showed a cozy little house. Wooden floors, big windows, a front porch with a couple of chairs for sipping morning coffee. Nothing fancy, but clean and charming. Exactly what I needed. I left on a Friday after work, driving about 3 hours through highways that gradually turned into narrow, twisting roads lined with trees. The town, if you could call it that, was little more than a main street with a gas station, a diner, and a general store. My phone signal flickered in and out as I drove past. I reached the house just as the sun was setting. The Airbnb was at the end of a gravel road, partially hidden by thick trees. It looked just like the pictures. A small, single-story house with weathered wood siding and a front porch that creaked slightly when I stepped on it. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the fresh air. The woods surrounding the house were dense and dark, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. I unlocked the door with the code the host had sent me. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood and old books. The floors creaked as I walked through, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The living room was cozy, with a worn couch, a coffee table covered in magazines, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. There was a small kitchen with outdated appliances and a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed and a thick quilt. Everything was just as advertised, simple and peaceful. I unpacked my bag, put some groceries in the fridge, and made myself a quick dinner. After eating, I settled on the couch with a book. The only sound in the house, the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the old wooden frame. The first night was uneventful. I slept deeply, waking up only once when I thought I heard something outside. It was probably an animal, a raccoon or a deer, but it startled me enough that I got out of bed and peered out the window. The yard was empty, just shadows from the trees swaying in the moonlight. I went back to bed and fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I made coffee and sat on the porch, listening to the birds and watching the sun rise over the trees. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. I spent most of the day reading, walking through the woods behind the house, and just enjoying the silence. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of birds. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather, and the light drizzle quickly turned into a steady rain. I retreated inside, lighting a few candles and curling up on the couch with my book. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and the house felt warm and cozy. It was around 8 p.m. when I noticed something strange. I had gone into the bedroom to grab my phone charger and realized the window was open, not just unlocked, open wide, letting in the cool, damp air. I was sure I hadn't opened it. I remembered checking the windows when I arrived, making sure everything was secure. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe I had opened it earlier and forgotten, or maybe it hadn't latched properly and the wind pushed it open. It was an old house, after all. I closed the window, locked it, and made a mental note to check the others. I spent the rest of the evening on the couch, trying to focus on my book but feeling distracted. Every creak of the house felt louder than it should have, every shadow stretching a little too far. At around 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I checked all the windows and doors again, making sure they were locked. Satisfied, I turned off the lights and crawled into bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart racing. At first, I didn't know why. The house was silent, the kind of deep, oppressive silence that makes your ears strain for any sound. I lay there, listening, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Then I heard it. A faint creak, like a footstep on the wooden floor, came from the living room. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing. Maybe it was the house settling, I told myself, or an animal on the porch. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I listened, straining to hear more. Another creak, closer this time. My mind raced. I hadn't heard a car pull up, and there was no reason anyone would be out here in the middle of the night. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers trembling. No signal. Of course. I cursed under my breath, trying to think. Another sound. This time, it was unmistakable. The soft thud of a footstep right outside the bedroom door. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I needed to move, to do something. But what? There was no lock on the bedroom door, and the only way out was through the living room. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet pressing into the cold floor. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight from the nightstand, and crept toward the door. My pulse pounded in my throat as I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. Finally, I took a deep breath and opened the door, holding the flashlight like a weapon. The living room was dark, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. It was empty. I walked through the house, checking every corner, every closet. Nothing. The front door was still locked, the windows still shut. There was no sign of anyone. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that I was just jumpy from being alone in an unfamiliar place. But it felt too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I slept with the flashlight in my hand that night, barely dozing, every creak and groan of the house setting me on edge. The next morning, I considered leaving. I even packed up my bag, ready to cut the trip short. But I felt silly. What would I tell the host? That I got scared because of some noises in the night? It was probably just the house settling or an animal outside. I decided to stay, but I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the day close to the house, checking my phone for a signal every few minutes. By late afternoon, the clouds returned and the rain started again. That night, I locked everything up as tightly as I could. I double-checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. Then I settled on the couch with a movie, trying to distract myself. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the hum of the fridge and the soft glow of the lamps vanishing in an instant. I sat there for a moment, my eyes adjusting to the dark. I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I decided to wait it out, hoping the power would come back soon. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the silence became unbearable. I could hear every creak, every drip of rainwater against the windows. Then, somewhere outside, I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 steady taps, like someone was testing the door. My heart was in my throat. I pointed the flashlight toward the front door, the beam illuminating the wooden frame. I couldn't see anyone through the window. The knock came again. I stood up, my legs shaky. I crept toward the door, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. When I reached it, I hesitated, my breath caught in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. I waited, listening, the rain tapping softly against the roof. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps walking away from the house. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting for them to come back. But they never did. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, the flashlight in my lap. Every light in the house turned on as soon as the power returned. I watched the windows, waiting for the figure to return, but the woods remained dark and empty. By morning, I had made up my mind. I packed my things and left without looking back. I didn't care if the host thought I was crazy or if I lost the money for the last night. I just needed to get out of there. Driving away, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The further I got from the house, the lighter I felt. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that someone was watching me that weekend. Someone who knew I was alone. When I booked the Airbnb, I wasn't expecting luxury. Just a quiet place to crash for a few days while I cleared my head. Work had been overwhelming, and I needed to get away, somewhere low-key. I found a listing about 3 hours from my city. A small house in a rural area, affordable, secluded. The photos showed a modest but clean place. White walls, hardwood floors, a worn but cozy couch, and a basic kitchen. Nothing fancy, but perfect for some peace and quiet. The host, Tom, had decent reviews, mostly short and generic. Nice place, quiet stay, would come back again. I didn't think much of it. The price was right, and the location was exactly what I needed. Isolated, surrounded by trees, with the nearest neighbor half a mile away. I booked it for 4 nights. The drive was uneventful. The further I got from the city, the quieter it became. By the time I turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to the house, my phone signal had dropped completely. Not unusual for rural areas, but it still made me a little uneasy. The house was smaller than it looked in the photos, but otherwise exactly as described. A simple single-story structure with peeling white paint and a small front porch. A forest stretched out behind it, thick and dark even in daylight. I parked, grabbed my bag, and headed to the front door. There was a lockbox with the key, just like Tom had said in his message. I punched in the code and opened it. The house smelled faintly of mildew, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. I walked through the living room, turned on a couple of lights, and checked the place out. It was basic but fine. A couch, a coffee table, a small TV, a kitchenette with an old fridge humming quietly in the corner. The bedroom was simple. A queen bed with a worn quilt, a small dresser, and a single window facing the driveway. The bathroom was clean enough, though the faucet dripped slowly into the sink. I set my bag down and tried to connect to the Wi-Fi.
No lag.
I restarted my phone, but it didn't help. I figured I'd deal with it later. For now, I just wanted to relax. It was quiet, too quiet. I'm used to city noise, sirens, traffic, people yelling outside at all hours. Here, there was nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves and the creak of the house settling. I sat on the couch, scrolling through some offline files on my phone and trying to ignore the eerie stillness. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I locked the front door, checked the back door, and made sure all the windows were secure. The old lock on the bedroom window seemed flimsy, but it was better than nothing. I crawled into bed, turned off the light, and stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the house. Every creak and groan felt louder in the dark. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up around 2 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure why. The house was silent, and the darkness felt heavier than before. I lay there, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the unfamiliar surroundings messing with my head. But then I heard it, a soft sound, like footsteps. It was faint, coming from the living room. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. Maybe it was the house settling again, I told myself. Old houses make weird noises, but something about it felt wrong, too deliberate, too human. I reached for my phone. No signal.
No Wi-Fi.
I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. I debated whether I should get up and check or stay in bed and hope it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, steady, right outside the bedroom door. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed the lamp from the nightstand and held it like a weapon, my pulse thudding in my ears. The doorknob rattled. Not a lot, just a soft jiggle like someone testing it. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, barely breathing. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. The rattling stopped. For what felt like an eternity, everything was silent again. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. I stayed there, frozen, until I couldn't hear anything but my own heartbeat. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack, slipped on my shoes, and crept toward the bedroom window. It was old and stuck a little, but after a few tense seconds, I managed to slide it open. The night air was cold and smelled like damp earth. I swung one leg out, then the other, and dropped down onto the grass. I crouched there, listening. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent. I didn't see anyone. No movement, no light. I started toward my car, keeping low, trying to stay in the shadows. My heart was in my throat, every step feeling like it took hours. Finally, I reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and got the door open. I slid in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights lit up the front of the house. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in one of the windows, a shadow shifting behind the curtain. I didn't stick around to find out. I threw the car into reverse, spun around, and sped down the gravel driveway, tires kicking up dust. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away from the house. Only then did I pull over, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they ached. My phone still had no signal. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I drove to the nearest gas station where I finally got a signal. I called the police and told them everything. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I never heard back. A few days later, I got an automated message from Airbnb saying my stay had been canceled and I'd been refunded.
No explanation.
I checked the listing, but it was gone. The house didn't exist on the site anymore. To this day, I have no idea who or what was in that house with me. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never stay in an isolated Airbnb again. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. That's all I needed. I'd been burnt out from work, and the noise of the city was eating away at me. So I booked an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere, somewhere I could unplug and just breathe for a couple of days. The listing described it as a cozy cabin tucked deep in the woods, perfect for relaxation and solitude. The photos showed a quaint little cabin with rustic wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that overlooked the trees. Exactly what I was looking for.
No Wi-Fi, no nachbors, no distractions.
Just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet. I packed light, a couple of changes of clothes, a few books, and enough snacks to last me the weekend. The drive out took about 4 hours. As I got closer, the roads narrowed, twisting and turning through dense forests. My phone lost signal about 20 minutes before I arrived, and the GPS froze on the screen. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was just like the pictures. Small and charming, surrounded by tall pines and a thick carpet of leaves. The sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and headed inside. The interior was simple but cozy. Wood everywhere, floors, walls, ceiling. All of it smelled faintly of pine and something older, like it had been sitting empty for a long time. The fireplace was cold and dark, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, but it had its charm. There was no welcome note or guidebook like most Airbnbs have, but I didn't think much of it. The key had been in the lockbox, just like the host said it would be, and that was good enough for me. I set my bag down in the bedroom and went to check out the rest of the place. The kitchen was stocked with basic utensils, and there were some canned goods in the pantry, though most of them looked like they'd been there for years. I found a stack of firewood by the back door and decided to get a fire going before it got too dark. By the time the fire was crackling, the sun had disappeared behind the trees, and the cabin was bathed in the soft, flickering light of the flames. I made myself a sandwich, cracked open a beer, and settled into the worn-out couch with a book. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of distant animals. Just the occasional pop of the fire and the wind rustling through the trees. I told myself that was the point, to get away from everything. But as the hours passed, the silence started to feel heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. I tried to shake it off. After all, I was alone in the woods. Of course, it would be quiet. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. The bedroom was small but cozy, with a heavy wooden bed frame and a thick quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. I locked the front door, checked the back door twice, and crawled into bed. I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up to the sound of something outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. At first, I thought it might be a branch knocking against the side of the cabin, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. I sat up in bed, straining to listen.
Top, top, top.
It was coming from the front porch. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I hadn't seen a landline in the cabin either. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog, maybe. Still, I got out of bed and crept to the window, careful not to make any noise. I pulled the curtain back just a fraction of an inch and peered outside. The porch was empty. The tapping had stopped. I stood there for a long time, waiting to see if it would start again, but the only thing I heard was the wind in the trees. Finally, I let the curtain fall back into place and crawled back into bed. It took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, the sun was shining, and the cabin didn't feel nearly as creepy. I made myself some coffee, sat on the porch, and tried to convince myself that I'd overreacted. But when I went to check the front door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The lock was broken. It wasn't completely busted. The door was still closed, but the latch was bent, and there were fresh scratches around the keyhole, like someone had been trying to force it open. My first thought was that I should pack up and leave, but then I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the lock had already been like that, and I just hadn't noticed. I spent most of the day hiking the trails around the cabin, trying to clear my head. The woods were beautiful, and for a while I managed to forget about the night before. But when I got back to the cabin, something felt off. The door was closed, just like I'd left it, but when I stepped inside, I noticed little things that were out of place. The book I'd left on the couch was on the floor. The cabinet under the sink was open, even though I hadn't touched it. And then there was the smell, a faint, sour odor that hadn't been there before. I checked every room, every closet, every corner of the cabin. There was no one there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. That prickling at the back of my neck, the sense that I was being watched. That night, I locked the bedroom door and wedged a chair under the handle, just in case. I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside had me sitting up, heart pounding. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the cabin. They stopped outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to listen. The doorknob rattled, but the chair held. The footsteps moved away, back toward the living room. I stayed in bed, too scared to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the bedroom, the front door was wide open. The lock was completely shattered, hanging loose from the doorframe. I grabbed my bag and ran to the car without looking back. As I drove away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was no one there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, hidden in the shadows of the trees. I never reported what happened. What would I even say? That I got scared in a cabin in the woods? But I never went back to another Airbnb after that, and I never will. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. It wasn't part of some grand plan. I just needed a break. The past few weeks had been draining. Work was nonstop, and my social life was basically non-existent. I hadn't had a decent night's sleep in a while, and it felt like everything was stacking up against me. I wanted some time to disconnect, be on my own, and breathe. Nothing fancy, just peace and quiet. I found a small house listed on Airbnb about 2 hours out of the city. It wasn't luxurious, but it looked clean and had a rustic charm. The photos showed a small, one-story home with a wraparound porch and large windows. It was tucked away in the woods, far enough from the nearest town to feel isolated, but not so far that I couldn't drive back for supplies if I needed anything. The host's description called it a cozy retreat with modern amenities and plenty of privacy. Sounded perfect. A few days of solitude in the middle of nowhere was exactly what I needed. The booking process was smooth. The host, someone named Eli, didn't say much, just sent me the check-in instructions with a key code for the lockbox. There were no red flags, no signs that this trip would be anything but peaceful. I packed light, clothes, a couple of books, some snacks, and my laptop. I figured I might get some work done if the mood struck, but mostly I just wanted to read and sleep. The drive out there was uneventful. The last stretch of road was a narrow dirt path surrounded by thick trees. My phone lost signal about 20 minutes before I arrived, but I didn't mind. That was part of the appeal, disconnecting from everything. When I pulled up to the house, it looked just like the pictures, maybe a little older and more weathered, but still charming. The porch creaked under my feet as I walked to the front door, and the wind rustled the trees around me. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I told myself that was part of the experience. I punched in the code, opened the door, and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, like the house had been closed up for a while. It smelled faintly of wood and something else I couldn't place, something slightly sour. The layout was simple. A small living room with an old couch and a TV, a kitchen with dated appliances, and a hallway that led to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything looked clean enough, though a bit worn around the edges. I dropped my bag in the bedroom and decided to take a quick walk around the property before unpacking. The house sat on a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. There was a fire pit in the backyard and a narrow trail that disappeared into the trees. I thought about following it but decided against it. I didn't want to get lost on my first day. Back inside, I unpacked, made a quick dinner, and settled onto the couch with a book. The silence was almost oppressive, but I told myself I'd get used to it. That first night was uneventful. I slept surprisingly well, the kind of deep sleep I hadn't had in weeks. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining, and everything felt a little less heavy. I spent most of the day reading and lounging around. I went for a short walk on the trail behind the house but didn't venture too far. The woods were dense, and it was easy to lose sight of the house. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I was in bed, scrolling through photos on my phone, when I heard something outside. It was a faint noise at first, almost like footsteps, but not quite. More like something brushing against the side of the house. I sat up and listened, my heart starting to race. There it was again, a soft scraping sound, like someone running their fingers along the wall. I told myself it was probably an animal. This was the woods, after all. Maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But something about the sound felt wrong. It was too deliberate, too slow. I got out of bed and walked to the front window, peeking through the curtain. The porch light cast a dim circle of light, but beyond that, everything was pitch black. I couldn't see anything. I stood there for a while, waiting for the sound to come back, but it didn't. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and went back to bed. The next morning, I found scratches on the side of the house, right under the bedroom window. They weren't deep, but they were long, 4 parallel lines running down the wood. I stared at them for a while, trying to figure out what could have caused them. A bear? Some kind of large bird? I didn't know much about wildlife, but the marks looked too clean, too precise to be an accident. Still, I didn't want to overthink it. The last thing I needed was to freak myself out over nothing. The day passed without incident, but as the sun started to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the noise came back. This time, it was louder. It started with the same soft scraping, but then there were thumps, heavy, deliberate thumps, like someone walking around the house. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The footsteps circled the house, slow and steady, stopping every few seconds before starting again. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it out the window. The light cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. Then the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for them to start again, but the only sound was the wind in the trees. I stayed up the rest of the night, my eyes glued to the window. By morning, I felt like a zombie. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to admit that I was scared. I told myself I was being ridiculous. This was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. I decided to stay one more night. That evening, I locked all the doors and windows and double-checked the lock on the front door. I even pushed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I sat on the couch, watching TV, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in my chest. Around midnight, the noise started again. This time, it was right outside the living room window. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from one window to the next. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, clutching my phone, my thumb hovering over the call button. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the front door rattled. It wasn't a knock. It was more like someone testing the handle, trying to see if it would give. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp from the side table, and stood frozen in the middle of the room. The door rattled again, harder this time. I backed up slowly, my eyes locked on the door. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. But the house stayed silent. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I threw my stuff into my bag, barely taking the time to fold anything, and headed for the door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold and still. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my feet as I walked to my car. I glanced back at the house one last time before getting in. That's when I saw it. In the dirt near the front steps were footprints, bare human footprints, leading from the woods to the front door and back again. My stomach dropped. I locked the car doors and started the engine, my eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway. I never reported it. What would I even say? No one would believe me, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in that house. Not really. And whoever or whatever had been out there, they were still watching when I left. I booked the Airbnb out of desperation. It wasn't the kind of place I'd normally stay at, way too remote for my taste. But I was late planning my trip and everything else was booked or too expensive. I needed a break. Life had been heavy lately, and I thought a few days in the countryside might help me reset. This place looked peaceful enough. A small, two-bedroom cabin tucked into the woods outside a town I'd never heard of. The photos made it seem cozy, simple but clean. The host's profile was sparse. No real description, just a generic photo of a middle-aged man named Tom, and a few positive reviews saying things like, "Great stay," and "Quiet, just what we needed." It wasn't much to go on, but I figured it was fine. People don't always put a lot of effort into their Airbnb profiles, right? The drive out was longer than I expected. 2 hours outside the city turned into 3 after I missed a turn and had to double back. My GPS struggled to keep a signal once I hit the back roads, but I eventually found my way onto a dirt path surrounded by trees. The sun was already setting by the time I arrived. The cabin looked exactly like it did in the photos, small and boxy, with a wraparound porch and a metal roof that caught the fading light. There was no cell service, not a single bar. That bothered me more than I cared to admit. I told myself it would be good to unplug for a while. I parked, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the front door. The key was in a lockbox just like the host said it would be. I let myself in. The inside was plain but clean. Wood-paneled walls, a worn leather couch, a small kitchen with mismatched appliances. There was a faint smell of something musty, like the place hadn't been aired out in a while, but it wasn't terrible. Just old house smell. I dropped my bags in the bedroom and checked the windows to make sure they locked properly. The sun was almost gone now, the woods outside turning black. There were no curtains, which made me feel a little exposed. I told myself to stop being paranoid. I spent the first night settling in, making a simple dinner and scrolling through the few photos I'd saved to my phone. I missed having internet. It felt weird being so disconnected, but I figured I'd get used to it. The next morning, I went for a walk. There was a trail behind the cabin that led into the woods. The air was crisp and cool, and the leaves crunched under my feet. I walked for about half an hour before turning back. When I got back to the cabin, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. Nothing was obviously out of place, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like I was being watched. I shook it off and went inside. I spent most of the day reading a book I'd brought with me. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to take another walk. This time, I went the other direction, following the dirt road past the cabin. After about 10 minutes, I came to a fork. One path continued down the road, while the other veered off into the woods. There was a no trespassing sign nailed to a tree near the second path. I turned around and went back to the cabin. That night, things got strange. It started with a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, steady creaking noise, like wood bending under pressure. But then it stopped and started again. It wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was coming from the porch. I froze, listening. Creak, pause, creak. Someone was walking on the porch. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. My heart was pounding in my chest as I made my way to the window. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I peeked through the glass. Nothing. The porch was empty. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting for the sound to start again. Didn't. After a few minutes, I told myself it must have been an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a stray cat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and went to bed. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found footprints on the porch. Human footprints. They were faint, but they were there. Muddy tracks leading up to the front door and back down the steps. My stomach dropped. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little noise. I didn't go for a walk. I didn't do much of anything. I just sat in the cabin, waiting for the day to end. When night fell, I turned on every light in the house. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone even though I knew it was useless without service. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was a perfectly logical explanation for everything that had happened. And then I heard it again. Creak, pause, creak. Someone was on the porch. I stood up, heart racing. Creak. It was getting closer. I moved to the window and peeked out. This time there was someone there. A man, standing at the edge of the porch, staring at the front door. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was watching the door, not moving, just standing there. I backed away from the window, trying not to make a sound. My mind was racing. What do I do? Call for help? No service. Hide? Run? I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the back door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could and slipped outside. The woods were pitch black. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. Felt like forever. Branches scratched at my face and arms, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was sure I was far enough away from the cabin. I hid behind a tree, trying to catch my breath. The forest was silent.
No footsteps. No voices.
Just the sound of my own breathing. I waited for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. Car was coming down the dirt road. I ran toward it, waving my arms. The driver stopped. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a kind face and a truck full of firewood. "You okay?" he asked, rolling down his window. I told him everything, about the footprints, the man on the porch, how I'd run into the woods to get away. He frowned. "That cabin's been empty for years," he said. "No one's lived there since the owner passed away. It's not even listed as a rental." I stared at him, my mind reeling. He offered to drive me into town, and I didn't hesitate. I climbed into his truck, grateful to be anywhere but that cabin. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood silent and dark, hidden among the trees. But I could have sworn I saw someone standing in the window watching us leave.